This is Lecture 7A, Part 1, Origins of Cultivated Crops. The plant you see here is called the glass gem corn, and I like to use glass gem corn to introduce the idea of origins of cultivated crops. It has a really interesting history. It became kind of an internet sensation in 2012 when this picture was posted. In fact, I grew my own glass gem corn in 2012 because of this beautiful picture. And glass gem corn is the result of a farmer named Charles Barnes. Charles Barnes is part Cherokee, and he became very interested 30 or 40 years ago in reclaiming some of his own heritage and his Cherokee tribal heritage by trying to reclaim some of the corn lines that his tribe was known to grow. So over these decades, he's been selecting for some of the most interesting and colorful of the corn lines. And this resulted in this beautiful glass gem corn that has actually become quite hard to find and very popular. I have some of my own pictures I'll be happy to show you in class someday if you'd like to see them. Anyway, I think this is a nice way to begin because it shows you that even within a few decades, we can make some significant changes to cultivated crops through this process of selective breeding. Origins of cultivated crops is one of my very favorite lessons. When I first started teaching, so 15 years ago, and textbooks would report that humans began cultivating crops about 10,000 years ago. Over the last decade or so, a lot of interesting new anthropological research has come out, some suggesting that humans have started cultivating crops at least 13,000 years ago. It's my own personal opinion that humans have been cultivating crops at least 20,000 years. There's some evidence in fig cultivation that is a fairly sophisticated cultivation process that suggests that humans have been cultivating this for thousands and thousands of years. So I think we've been doing this for a while. And the strong evidence suggests we've been doing it for at least 13,000 years. So our learning objectives for this lesson are probably a little bit different than what you think they might be. We are going to discuss the history and origins of our most common foods, but we're going to do that by looking at two really important researchers, Vavilov and Lysenko. These were Russian researchers, and they're a great contrast to each other. We're going to look at some of the results of Dr. Vavilov's work, where he determined the centers of origin of cultivated crops. And we'll talk a little bit about crops of the future. Now, this lesson leads us to some basic plant breeding theory. That lesson, though, will actually be in the second, not part 2, not 7A part 2, but it will actually be in 7B, so the next voice thread. And in that lesson, we'll talk about meiosis, as well as basic inheritance, and some basic plant breeding strategy. These beautiful plants are Sarracenia flava. They're a wild species found in the southeastern United States. And I'm pointing them out to you now because I'm going to contrast a cultivated species in the next slide. So these are wild species, and the next slide it will be about cultivated plants. So you most likely had a kindergarten or first grade class where you took a little plastic bag or paper cup and planted seeds and watched them grow. And probably some of your seeds died because nobody watered them, but mostly your seeds germinated in a week or so, and some might have even survived the trip home. These are cultivated. When you plant most cultivated seeds, they'll grow if you give them some water and some nice warm soil. But if you tried to plant those Sarracenia seeds from the slide that I showed you previously, using the same strategy, you'd find that you'd have very little germination. And that's because the wild species have many dormancy factors in play that will keep the seed from germinating. We select against all of these kinds of seed dormancy in cultivated plants. This is just one example of a way that we've cultivated our crops. So the example I just gave you here of a cultivated crop is something that we can put in the ground, throw some water on, and get to germinate right away. And the contrast from the wild species that I showed you is those seeds require some significant hoop jumping to overcome the the dormancy barriers on the seeds. What are some other ways that cultivated plants are different than wild plants? We'll be exploring that in the next few slides. As I stated earlier, we know humans began cultivating crops at least 10,000 years ago, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest it was much earlier than that. To me, it's pretty incredible to think of agriculture and the advancements of agriculture in that relatively short period of time. The man on the left here is actually my first PhD advisor, Dr. Guri Johal. And Dr. Johal went on to discover some fascinating plant characteristics called disease lesion mimics. I've posted a link for you on Blackboard so you can read more about them if you're interested. But essentially, these are plants that actually mimic diseases when they're not diseased. Dr. Johal not only discovered these disease lesion mimics, but he used them to discover a very, very important gene. So, in plant pathology, we have something called the gene for gene theory, that there's this matching gene in a host plant and a corresponding gene in a pathogen. Decades ago, we found the gene in the host plant, but we never found a corresponding gene in the pathogen. So Dr. Johal actually was the first person to discover this matching gene in the pathogen. It was a pretty profound discovery. And I use this contrast because it shows our understanding of crop production is actually a lot more complex than most people consider. We know there was a long, slow process of selection and that this took place over a millennia, but the more nuanced process of plant breeding and genetics is generally not very well understood by non-plant scientists. So we'll talk more about this in this lecture and then in an upcoming lesson next week. For now, though, let's get back to our discussion regarding the origins of cultivated plants. And a question that comes up time and time again regarding crop cultivation is why? Why did people actually bother to begin to cultivate their food? If you've ever grown food, you probably can attest to the fact that it's actually a lot of work, and it tends to be kind of unpredictable in outcome. You can have the environment destroy everything, have a drought or a flood or a infestation of some type of pest or pathogen. So even if you're incredibly careful and super well planned out, everything can go wrong in some cases. Sometimes people will say that societies became agrarian because it was less work, but most anthropologists will counter that claim by showing it's actually far more laborious and time consuming to cultivate food than it is to be a hunter gatherer. Here are some of the theories behind why some societies became agrarian. We know that many agrarian societies grew up independent of each other across the entire globe and over different time periods. So ultimately, there's probably many reasons different societies became agrarian societies. There's one theory that some of these societies became agrarian societies due to religion. Perhaps they needed particular types of crops at various types of times of the year that supported whatever religious cultural practices. There are some that theorize that some of these cultures became agrarian due to refuse heaps, that they actually saw refuse heaps from the points that they would migrate to from their hunter gatherer lifestyle. The refuse heaps would contain all of the leftover plant material that they had been gathering, and would grow the actual plants that they wanted. So rather than having to go out and harvest it, they would have it there in the refuse heaps. Another theory is weeds. So disturbed sites like campsites, we are more likely to see the weeds that perhaps could be plants that people wanted. And there's another theory that there was just a genius. So literally 1 in a million people is a genius. Statistically, that's what they tell us. So it's highly likely that there were some geniuses floating around in 10,000 years ago, and that these geniuses had this aha moment and actually figured out the idea of selective breeding, and this helped to kind of instigate an agrarian lifestyle. There's as many theories as there are people. There's all kinds of interesting conversation about this, and I'll provide some links for you. But I just included this so you could kind of start thinking a little bit, noodling on the idea of, well, why would a particular culture actually choose? How would they know to cultivate their food? Like, how would they understand the process? Number one, and number two, what would compel them to do so? So there's kind of two parts to that why question, isn't there? So, what are some additional differences between a cultivated species and its wild relative? So, this is a comparison of wild potatoes here on the right and cultivated potatoes here on the left. And one thing that we almost universally say about cultivated crops is that they have a reduced ability to compete. So a cultivated plant will need to live in an environment that is, protected from all the other environmental factors that the wild relative is usually able to withstand. But with that cultivation practice, we will usually gain something we call gigantism. So the crop, whatever portion of the plant that we're harvesting, might be significantly larger in the cultivated plant versus the wild relative. We will often see very important changes in the seed. So, for example, the wild relative of corn, it's called teosinte. Teosinte is about 20 feet tall, and it produces a really teeny tiny corn cob. And not only does it not produce a lot of corn, but the corn that it produces does something called shatters. That means that it falls off the cob onto the ground, and it's obviously very difficult to harvest. So its cultivated relative, we have selected against that. So we have selected for characteristics that allow the corn to stay on the cob, and of course the cob is much larger. In the wild species, we see more adaptations to the environment. In the cultivated species, we see a suppression of protective features. So, toxins, of course, poisons, those would be something we would select against, thorns, spines, etc. So, anything that the plant may have naturally had as a protective feature, we will tend to breed out. So go back to lab, think about lab. Remember when we looked at pears and we looked at the sclerenchyma tissue, the sclerids that are right next to the core of the pear? Well, that's actually a protective feature. So if you look at the wild pears, we find lots and lots of those sclerids. They're practically like eating crunchy, sandy gravel. But in the cultivated pear, we select against that, and there's really not very many of them. And another significant and important difference in the cultivated plants is the loss of genetic diversity. So typically in a cultivated plant, we're going to have a much more uniform type of crop. Much of what we know about the wild relatives of our cultivated plants actually originated from the work of Nikolai Vavilov. Nikolai Vavilov was the premier Russian botanist and geneticist of his time, not just in Russia, but I would say across the world. His work has really helped us understand how and where all crops originated. But there's an important and very compelling side note to his life. He had an amazing but very tragic life that I always like to talk about because it's a wonderful contrast for scientists to see the work of Nikolai Vavilov contrasted with his nemesis, Lysenko. So we'll see that in the upcoming slides. Vavilov was a geneticist at a time in Russian history when Mendelian genetics were extremely unpopular with the Communist Party. From 1936 till about 1938, Joseph Stalin led what is now referred to as the Great Purge. During that era, the Communist Party set out to literally purge political dissidents, using, in some cases, a mobile gas van, a van that they would drive around that contained poisonous gas, and they would kill people that didn't agree with their political philosophy. This is actually a historical fact. So the other guy here is Trofim Lysenko. He was also a geneticist, but he denounced Mendelian genetics and really targeted Vavilov as a political dissenter. As an aside, not only did Lysenko terribly discredit Vavilov and put Vavilov in great danger, his quack science probably resulted in the starvation deaths of up to millions of people. That's a whole nother story. But anyway, Lysenko really won the favor of Stalin and discredited Vavilov. Vavilov stood by his beliefs, but he was just not able to stand up against the fascist hysteria that was really gripping Russia at the time. He was imprisoned and he was almost executed, except his friend stood up for him, and so instead of being imprisoned, he was put into this horrible, terrible prison for 20 years. He actually died before his prison sentence ended. But even more poignant, his life's work that we'll talk about in the upcoming slides. So part of his life's work was actually going around the world, literally around the world. He was among the very first person on the planet to do this, to think to do this. He was going around to the origins of cultivated plants, collecting these rare wild relatives and preserving them in a seed bank. Well, he had thousands of collections there. In fact, this plant seed bank still exists. But after Vavilov was imprisoned, things actually got a lot worse for the people running this seed institute, because in September 1941, the siege of Leningrad began. And this is when Nazi forces cut off all imports to the city. They stationed military battalions around the exits, and everyone in the city basically got starved out. So residents of Leningrad were storming the seed bank, trying to get in, trying to get food. They were begging the people that worked there to provide them with some of those seeds that they could eat. And even more touching than that, and the people would not give, the workers would not give in. Even more touching than that, the workers didn't eat the seeds themselves. Though they actually, many of them starved to death rather than eat the seeds that Vavilov had spent his life to collect. And Vavilov unfortunately also starved to death. And a lot of this was the result, was due to the discrediting of by Lysenko. I think this Lysenko quote nicely sums up the kind of quote-unquote scientist Lysenko really was. So he says, in order to obtain a certain result, you must want to obtain precisely that result. If you want to obtain a certain result, you will obtain it. I need only such people as will obtain the results I need. So no mention of fact or scientific theory or scientific process, just if you want a result, you will get a result. That is really not science. this is what the Russian government now says about Lysenko. He is responsible for the shameful backwardness of Soviet biology and of genetics in particular, for the dissemination of pseudoscientific views, for adventurism, for the degradation of learning, and for the defamation, firing, arrest, even death of many genuine scientists. But interestingly, Lysenko died in a comfortable apartment in a nice neighborhood with a good reputation in the year 1975. And I like to mention that because I was born in 1975. So sometimes when we think about this type of history, we think of this as, ancient history, right? But this actually was not that long ago. This occurred in the 1930s and 1940s. Lysenko continued to lead a comfortable life until the day he died. Actually, I think he died like right on my birthday. It's really weird. And this is actually relatively modern history. So I think, again, it's important for us as scientists, future scientists, and citizens, and even if you're not going to become a scientist, people that will have to make decisions, political decisions, to see how politics and science sometimes don't have very happy marriages. Despite the political nightmare in which Vavilov lived, he was actually astoundingly productive and developed two fundamental concepts in our understanding of the origin of cultivated crops. The first, the law of homologous series and variation. So he based this on theories of other biologists, particularly Darwin and Gustav Henrich. He used methods of plant breeding and plant systematics to explain how closely related plants tend to vary from each other in similar patterns across species for both genetics and morphology. He further illustrated his theory by showing how phenotypic traits, these are traits that you can actually visualize, you can see them, that these phenotypic traits follow parallel, predictable patterns in crops such as wheat and rye. And more importantly, perhaps, was the center of origin of cultivated crops. So this is when he proposed that there are areas of the world that have greater diversity in cultivated crop in the wild relatives of cultivated crops than other areas of the world. And he said these are the areas where humans first cultivated these plants. And according to Vavilov, these areas of first cultivation represent the centers of evolutionary origin of these plant varieties. And the center of origin, for example, of wheat would be the place where the diversity of the genetic relatives of wheat would be the greatest. And so Vavilov actually spent many decades traveling to these centers of origin to understand them and also to collect the seeds of the wild relatives. So if you recall in my previous couple of slides ago, we talked about the institute that was being sieged during the siege of Leningrad and how the workers there protected the seeds. Well, you can see why they would protect those seeds. That was profoundly important work, and that institute actually still exists to this day. I covered a lot of this in the previous slide, but I'll highlight a couple of things here. Two terms, center of origin. So in the previous slide I told you that the center of origin is the region that Vavilov believed had the greatest diversity of a particular species. So for example, the center of diversity for potatoes would have the greatest diversity of wild relatives of potato at that site, and that was due to the fact that this is where early attempts to breed potato or to select for various traits in potato had occurred. And he labeled those regions centers of diversity. And he further refined them by identifying them as primary, secondary, or etc. centers. So a primary center would be the place where a particular crop was first attempted to be cultivated and then was disseminated from that point. And primary centers make up much smaller portion of the land area, and primary centers typically will have some kind of isolating factor, like a desert or mountain range, etc., to account for that unique genetic diversity within that primary center. There's been significant modification of the original Vavilov centers. So originally he listed 8 independent centers of origin, and it's been altered for the last 40 years due to recent advances in science. But the next series of slides will be a brief discussion of some of the modification of these centers, and I'm less concerned about that. I think that kind of makes logical sense, right? That someone makes a discovery and then we make advances based on that discovery. But what I would like you to pay attention to, and not memorize or anything, but when you do get to the slides on the centers of origin, I've kept those slides because they nicely show different parts of the world and a whole assortment of crops and where their center of origin of cultivation is. And I like that for a few reasons. It shows us, there's interesting little, trivia facts in that. But more importantly, I think it allows you to start to see a diversity of crop species. And I'm certain that you'll see crops listed in those centers of origin that you've never heard of before. And I'm certain that you'll see crops listed and their centers of origin that you never even thought before. Like, well, where does coffee come from? Why did it originate there? So I'm hoping what that does is help stimulate a little bit your thinking regarding your crop of the future. So please do take a look at those centers of origin. And again, I'm not asking you to memorize those or anything. It's really more of a point of interest and a point of kind of like, curiosity, getting you thinking about crop of the future and plant breeding in general. Again, here's just a little discussion regarding modification of Vavilov's original centers of origin. And here I have the Harlan centers. In fact, those are the centers that I'll be showing you in the upcoming slides. It's really, I don't think that big of a deal, other than it just shows scientific progress. And I wanted to introduce the centers that you're going to be seeing in the upcoming slides. I don't really have any text or voiceover until we get to the end of the slideshow, but for the next series of slides, just pay attention to the crop species and their centers of origin. And to sum it all up here, I hope thinking about the origins of these cultivated crops has stimulated some further interest in thinking about your crop of the future. So in your crop of the future, this was a lab activity that you should continue to be working on. I want you to be thinking about, why would this be a good crop? What's the benefit? And what types of manipulation of the plant would be required? In upcoming slideshows, we're going to be talking about the basic Mendelian inheritance. We'll be talking about basic plant breeding theory and strategy, and the nuts and bolts of actually conducting a cross. But I think you're still able to be creative about thinking about your crop of the future, and do a little research to think what crop might be a good choice, and have some reason to back up why you picked that crop.